Okay, so I will get us started. Okay, listeners, welcome back, or watchers if you're on YouTube. Welcome back to the Millennial Body Image Project. As you can see, we have a very special guest today. We have my friend Sarah Kesty, who is an executive function coach, and she's going to get into we're going to talk about ADHD, we're going to talk about burnout, we're going to talk about executive function, we're going to talk about food. It's going to be great because this has been a really popular topic for a lot of our listeners and a lot of the clients that Christina and I have been seeing lately, especially in the context of, the world being so stressful. So I would love to get started by if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to really want to get into executive function coaching.
Oh, yeah, good question. I think I was just drawn to it, but hi, I'm Sarah Kesty. I host the Executive Function podcast and I'm the founder of Brain Tools School. And yeah, that's what I do. I do executive function coaching. Short answer to how I got into it and why I'm passionate about it is I taught mostly middle school for nearly 20 years. And every time a student had a breakthrough or a meltdown, it tied to executive function. And every time they were able to student well and feel good and manage the things outside of life, it was executive function. And so my kind of door into learning about it was through the autism community and helping people with autism learn executive function. And then as I was realizing, like, hold on a second, all my kids with ADHD and all my kids with human brains needed this, then it was like a pretty easy win to then start innovating and testing out strategies and reading about it. And that developed into the nerdiness that you see in front of you right now.
Awesome. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about background for the listeners. Whenever we have a guest, even though I know you already and I've known you for a while, I always like to do a little bit of a deep dive on like your background and all the different things that you do and stuff. And one thing I didn't know about you, because I don't think we've ever talked about this before, is you very well know what it's like to have what we would call like an invisible illness, right? Or an invisible condition. And so this is something where it seems invisible to others because maybe it's not like a visual impairment in the sense that people can't see it, but it's something that really drastically impacts your life in the way that other people don't recognize. So could you tell us about that and how then that also led you to a connection with executive function coaching and wanting to help these populations?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I'm like, which one, Dana? Which one?
Well, whichever one you want to go into.
I mean, there's a few. I've had 26 surgeries, so there's that fun piece. I have a neuromuscular condition called CMT, Charcot-Marie-Tooth, which is named after three French scientists. Has nothing to do with your teeth. It's a degenerative nerve disease, but that makes being in this particular human body pretty tricky. Like I have chronic pain and obviously many, many surgeries to correct it. So I think that certainly gives me reverence for when things are really hard and from the outside it looks like effort and from the inside it's struggle. So in my own life, an example would be like sometimes I'm not walking very fast and my brain is saying go and my body's like, yeah, about that. This is all we got today. And from like I've had people call me lazy or clumsy or klutzy, and it obviously hurts. I mean, I can pull up the memories of some of those moments, not all of them, obviously, but it was that disconnect between what I was experiencing internally and what the world was giving me feedback on that really parallels when you have executive dysfunction. And I'm not here to pretend like I don't have executive function needs, like every human does, but if you have something that is particularly impactful, like autism or ADHD, you're having that same internal disconnect where it's like, if you're telling me I should be able to blah, 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 and I can't, then that internal feeling of what's wrong with me? How come I can't do this? Everybody needs me to. Or you've recognized like I'm really giving it my best. And then the feedback you're getting is like not good enough. My personal hatred for the word lazy, that kind of stuff. It's a really similar experience to, kind of help me walk in the shoes of anybody I work with. And I'm sure it's similar for you too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And it's so interesting because whenever I work with anyone with chronic health conditions, ADHD, burnout, I don't know, every single person that I work with, basically, it's like I have heard so many times from clients, "Oh, you really get it because you have been in my shoes," right? There's something
Mhm.
so different about either working with someone or hearing from someone on a podcast who has been in as close to your shoes as you possibly can, right? Because, of course, everyone always has a different experience. But one thing that I also want to go into that I hear so much from people with neurodivergence, with chronic health conditions, humans with brains, as you were saying, like with executive dysfunction, is that perfectionism is really, really hard in this, right? Because people with ADHD find a lot easier time when things are black and white. It
Mhm.
reduces some of the decision fatigue, like it reduces some of the, the things that you have to deal with every day. There's so many different things that we all have to deal with. And if there's any way that we can put stuff on autopilot, it can make that a little bit easier. However, when we have ADHD or something else that's impacting our executive function, that can also really run into a lot of barriers when you have perfectionism. I was gonna say issues, but, you know, when you have a personality trait that loves perfectionism, let's say. So, can you talk about how perfectionism impacts executive function or maybe gets in its way?
Right? And yeah, and you said like a brain that like loves it. Sometimes our brains feel like they need it. It's very scary
Mhm.
to get out of that lockstep, yes, no, black, white, because like you were saying, it kind of takes away some of the choice if you're like, I have A or B and that is all. But then when we get into the situation where it almost becomes paralysis, like, well, I can't start because I know it's not going to be perfect, or I can't um ask for help because everybody else is perfect with it, and obviously, like, they won't even know how to help me, and you're right in recognizing that kind of intertwining. It's almost like a cycle, like, perfectionism makes it hard to task initiate, which makes it hard to engage with any of the executive function tools, and at the same time, it also is kind of the f if it's the filter that you see yourself through, then it's gonna be really hard to engage with any sort of, like, self-coaching or curious observations of your brain, which is where we develop our skills, because if it's unsafe, if it's very judgmental of, like, "Well, that wasn't good enough," it's not a space where you're going to be able to see just, like, the small opportunities of adjustments. And that's not to say, like, if anybody's listening and they're like, "Oh, great, I'm even doing perfectionism wrong." It you know what I mean? It's not
Yeah.
to say that, like, you did it. I mean, there's research out there, and I'm a little bit horrified at the poor person who had to take this data, but, um by the age of 10, a kid with ADHD has heard 20,000 more negative comments about them. 20,000. So you think about like that rate, and it's coming from your peers, your teachers, your parents. And it may not even be direct negative. It might be more along the lines of like, why can't you just, or you should. But if you're working with that rate, no wonder you develop this sort of like protective cloak of perfectionism, because it feels scattered and confusing. And so you're gonna hold on to something that seems definite. And that's like that false safety that perfectionism gives us.
Mhm.
Is it
And it's
ironic
interesting.
that I couldn't say the word perfectionism well? I couldn't say it perfectly.
Oh, no. I mean, it just goes to show that you've worked a lot on overcoming if you had any perfectionism tendencies, because instead of that being debilitating, it was, "Oh, whatever. It was a funny thing," you know?
You
But
know what? I don't hard edit my show anymore, like, I leave some of the blips and weird things in
oh, yeah.
because I wanna model that that's what real life actually sounds like, you know? And,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
"Whoops, I pronounced that wrong," or, "I meant this when I said that," and yeah.
Mhm. I'm sure our listeners have heard or seen us do that on probably every single episode. You're in good
Good, we're
company.
human.
Yes, we are human. We are in good company. And, sometimes the stuff that we talk on this show can be really heavy. So I find leaving some of the lighter mistakes or accidents or like just funny blips in can really, help with things sometimes, keep it a little light. But
Totally.
what is so tough is like when you were talking about that statistic and you said the kids who have ADHD by age 10 have heard 20,000 more
Mhm.
like negative comments or thoughts or anything than others. The keyword there for me is actually
More.
more, right? Because it doesn't mean that they've only heard 20,000 because even kids who don't have ADHD or not on the neurodivergent spectrum have of course heard negative comments or negative judgments or anything. How many times have I or Christina or you've probably heard also how people distinctly remember body image comments, food comments, other stuff that we talk about so much on this show. Those plus 20,000 in addition to that. So it's no wonder that as kids, we develop these protective mechanisms like perfectionism, like people pleasing, like so many other things. Whereas now, we may think of those as like, well, this perfectionism, this people pleasing is actually getting in my way of executive function, of initiating tasks, of whatever. But in the past, and this is something that I also talk about with binge eating and other disordered eating behaviors, they were initially developed as a protective mechanism because maybe you
Mhm.
didn't know how to self soothe, or maybe you were trying to protect yourself from these different comments that you were getting at different times. So I think one thing that I know you're going to bring up at some point, but it's always so important to remember like we have to have so much self compassion for ourselves throughout this process. And whether you're in a process of like maybe wondering about a diagnosis of something on the neurodivergent spectrum, or you're just like, wow, hey, I don't have that, but I also struggle with executive function and maybe also perfectionism and maybe also people pleasing. Like everybody's struggling out here at this point. Right? So self-compassion is very, very helpful in this situation.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and that kind of leads me back to, like, an additional piece of, like, why does perfectionism or just that kind of general dysregulation impact executive function? And I
Mhm.
have now that we have visuals, Dana, I can use my cool brain.
There you
Um,
go.
and for listeners, I'm holding a little brain model by the brainstem, so it kinda looks like a
Not
popsicle.
her own brain, to be clear.
No, no, I hold that in my skull. That's all good. I don't even have to
That's good.
touch it.
Let's
It's
keep that in
all
there.
yes, please. When we think about, like, where our brain activity is, and you know this well, if we're more concerned with, like, our social safety, if we're like, "Hey, is this person liking me? Am I safe? Am I connected? Am I going to be, like, outed by the group?" We're gonna put ourselves in more of a framework of fight, flight, freeze, that sympathetic activation, which means the communication between our prefrontal cortex, which is where our executive function is not completely shut off. I mean, they call it like that amygdala hijack where they say like, "Oh, you can't use your thinking." You can, but
Animal
man, is it
brain.
a slog. Huh?
Yeah. Animal brain. Primal
Yes.
instincts only.
And we're even talking about like changes in blood flow and heart rate and things that you cannot physically, or should say like mentally control, and yet they're happening at the baseline level. All of that is taking away your ability to engage with executive function, which really stinks because executive function is also where you might cue yourself. You might notice those changes in your body and start cueing yourself, and then access the part of your brain that's saying, okay, I remember what to do when I feel XYZ. Here's how I calm down. And if we're in a situation where we can't really think about that, it's much, much harder to engage with the calming things, which is why I don't know about you, Dana, but it is a surefire way to make me extra mad if when I'm upset, somebody tells me to breathe because your eyes are rolling. Those strategies don't work when you're at the top of the escalation cycle, when you're in that really fight, flight, freeze kind of deal. So it's super interesting to think about you know, that self-compassion you're talking about, monitoring your perfectionism, just in the way of even if it seems a little woo-woo, or even if you're just like, well, I don't want to do that. That's too much for me. Just think of it as, well, that's brain friendly. That's your way to get to be able to access your executive function.
Hmm. So I would also love to talk about in a brain unfriendly situation, let's say, how does that impact eating behaviors?
Ooh, wait, give me more. What do you mean by brain unfriendly?
So when you're in this activated state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or you have been activated in that state, let's say many times over the past day, week, I don't know, the entire year of 2025, let's say, right?
Pour a
Which
hemp
is
globe.
contributing
Mhm,
contributing to a decreased capacity for executive function because your resources are running low, right?
mhm.
How does that then impact eating behaviors or how ADHDers might approach eating?
Gotcha. Okay. Yes. Um, woo, that's complicated, right? Because there's so many different
You're like,
directions.
"Do you want a graduate school course on this?"
Hello, sign up for our no, I'm just kidding. Um, I mean, maybe Dana and I will make that, but not
That
today.
would be so cool.
It would be cool. And listeners, you should check out her episode with me too, because she gave so many. Right. Okay. So Dana, getting back to the question, like how does dysregulation, how do those moments impact executive function and eating? I
Mhm,
think it's wild when we start to realize how much executive function goes into eating, that it's
mhm,
kind of like you cannot disconnect them. And it is one of the most common, like, kind of stealth manifestations of executive dysfunction that I help people with. Is they're like, "Oh yeah, I forget to eat, or I get so hungry and overwhelmed that I can't cook, or I never like refill my snacks, whatever it is." And they kind of just think it's a them-ism, or like a, "Oh, it's just one weird thing." It's not weird. It's executive function. And so just kind of becoming aware of how much you need to be able to do to feed yourself fairly consistently and healthy-ish is one kind of lens to then think about, okay, if I'm experiencing a ton of stress or like loads of dysregulation, not only am I gonna have a hard time planning, I'm gonna have a hard time, like, so, for example, like, planning maybe what to eat, making sure that you have those choices available, that they're easy, it's not, like, 10 steps to get into your food. I mean, honestly, sometimes, like, pre-cutting things or buying things pre-cut can make the difference between the mental and physical energy to get into it and actually eating it or not. So there's those. So our planning may be impacted, obviously. And then there's like the impulse control. So part of executive function is monitoring when we have an impulse and then making just the right amount of space in between when your brain thinks it and you act it, so that you have a chance to make a decision that's not instant.
mhm.
And when we're wiped out, when we're stressed, that's a way harder sell. We're way faster at almost, like, not even registering, like, comforting myself with food, and then we're making choices that maybe if we had the chance to sit back in a more regulated state and really, like, plan and prioritize and think about using our executive functions, we might not make those choices, and yet here we are with that dysregulated brain. So those are just a few examples, there's tons.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because when we talk about these tools of buy pre-cut fruit and vegetables, buy frozen things, buy convenience foods, other stuff like that, it's almost like when you have ADHD, there's this almost shame spiral that comes into it. It's like, why should I need those things? I don't
Mhm.
want to use that because I shouldn't have to, with quotes, use that, or I shouldn't need to use that. But like you said, it's just your brain. And one thing that I always reiterate with clients and on this show is when your demand is exceeding the supply in terms of dysregulation, meaning there's so many external and maybe also internal stressors
Mhm.
Your body doesn't need less nourishment and resources. Your body needs more nourishment and resources to support that. But even just acknowledging that can be even more overwhelming. What do you mean I need to eat more? I'm already so stressed and forgetting to eat. And now you're telling me that like I need to eat more. Or I'm so stressed that I'm going to binge eating. I'm going to restricting. I'm going to, again, what we were talking about before are these stools, coping skills, coping stools. Too much GI talk on the podcast. Oh my God, that's so funny. I'm going to keep that in. So,
Girl, I was like, "Wait, I gotta Google that. I don't know about coping skills. This is what makes me trust you." For sure.
coping skills, right? These are just some of the coping skills that we then default to, like you were talking about, right?
Mhm.
For some people, binge eating may feel like an impulse that they can't control, but the more dysregulated that you are, or the farther that you are away from feeling really resilient or at balance or centered or whatever you want to call it, the harder it is to quote control that impulse or choose another direction because the time between the moment of the impulse and the action is shortened, right?
Right.
So, it's just a really hard place to be in because when we're living in this world where everything is dysregulated, there's so much uncertainty, even with the food system. Of course, people are going to these coping tools that don't make them feel like they have a lot of agency over their decisions, which is really hard because on the one hand, it feels like you don't have a lot of agency. But then on the other hand, it's like, but I'm grasping for some aspect of control. But then it also feels like it's your fault in a way
I
because you're
know.
defaulting to these behaviors because you have less of that impulse control, which by the way is also impacted by the menstrual cycle and what phase you are at in your menstrual cycle. I will link another episode we did on that. But I also want to talk about how specifically related to food, but we can also go into, other areas of
Yeah.
the more dysregulated you are, and you kind of alluded to this before, task paralysis is so intense, right? Like this can happen even when you're not dysregulated with ADHD, but then specifically when it comes to food, it's so easy to fall into this when you're like, okay, I've got to figure out like what I want to eat. I have to get access to that food somehow. I have to make the food and then I also have to eat it. And each one of those big four steps has so many different steps under that. So when you're working with people who are having task paralysis come up, whether it's in relation to food or in relation to anything, what are some of the tools that you help them with to get over that, have self-compassion, or whatever direction you would like to go in?
Yeah, yeah, that makes so much sense, and we can stick with the food, ideas, although, like, generally, these a lot of these strategies apply to, like, paying bills or doing laundry or, we've all got a handful of things that paralyze us that we really super hate, and so
Mhm.
Um, sometimes it's the anticipation that we need to address. So, in an academic sense, I call it scan-in plans. We kind of like look through whatever assignment is coming up and say, okay, like, how bad is this? What do I see myself doing? And the more you kind of like get to know your enemy of the task, it's sort of your brain has turned it into this, like, giant lion, like, vaguely in the corner of your mind, and then when you shine your attention flashlight on it, you're like, maybe that's a bobcat or a house cat, like, it's not huge, I'm alright." And so and oftentimes it's paradoxical because I'm saying, like, "I don't wanna look at my task, I'm dreading it, I don't want more time with it." But if you can partner up with somebody that can kind of help you stay regulated and look at it, like look through the steps of cooking or look through the grocery process, whatever it is, and kind of partner up and say, okay, what do you see yourself doing? How long might this take? Where are the spots that we can infuse some kind of activation energy, like urgency or fun or connection? Those that can help, but don't beat yourself up if that's not instant because hi, hello. You've had 40 some years to develop these habits. It might not change overnight. I'm not psychic, but I'm going to make that prediction.
Might not change overnight. No way. But
No
I think you're
way.
right. And you know what's difficult is the more dysregulated that people are, the harder it is to acknowledge that this can't change overnight, even
Mhm.
if you overhaul your entire life, which is a task paralysis nightmare, right? Although
Colleges recommend that.
we wouldn't
Mhm.
recommend that. A new planner is not going to fix this as much as it is aesthetically pleasing, right?
For a
But
couple weeks, yeah.
yes, yes, exactly. But it's so difficult because when you are so dysregulated, when you are so taken away from your center, from your tools, from resilience, from executive functioning to the best of your ability, which of course is going to be different across the board, the farther that you are from that, the harder it is to give yourself that self-compassion and the harder it is to even use some of these tools that you're talking about because
Mhm.
everything seems hopeless and outside of your control. And that on its own can snowball into the what we have been calling like the ADHD guilt and shame spiral, which then snowballs into task paralysis, which is where it could be any day of the week. You're sitting there, your brain is racing a million miles a minute. You're like, I have so many things to do, but physically, your body's not doing anything. And so then
Mhm.
by the end of the day, you're exhausted, but you also feel so bad because you haven't been able to do any of these tasks that maybe could have made you feel better. But there's so many things getting in your way. And this can really lead to even more burnout. And I have
Um,
experienced this firsthand. Not just
it
once, many times. I'm
Yep.
sure you have experienced it. So many of my clients have experienced this. And so I think thinking about what you were saying is this seems like a big lion. Like Mufasa is over there. But maybe it's just a little house cat. Like maybe it is. I like that strategy of being like, let's shine a light on this, even though just trying to shine the light on it can be enough to initiate task paralysis itself.
Totally, and that's why if you have a Dana or a Sarah in your life, if you have a friend, if you have, just somebody that kinda gets it, that won't use a lot of, like, should language on you, see if you can team up and be like, "Hey, what are you dreading? Alright, here's what I'm dreading. Do you wanna help each other kind of, like, make plans through it?" And
Mhm.
that can make a huge difference because if you feel alone, it can almost turn into this shameful, like, "Well, now I can't even tell anybody because I shouldn't be struggling with this," and, like, I have learned so much from the amazing humans that I coach, and one of the things is there's nothing weird to struggle with. Like, I mean, it's so common, for example, when I first started, the amount of times that parents confided, like, this deep, dark secret that, like, "My kid doesn't brush his teeth." And I'm like, "Okay." And they're like, "Well, what? You're not like, that's not gross? Like, he's not in trouble?" That kind of feeling? I'm like, "No, we'll figure it out." And by the way, those kind of, like, self-care things, like wash your face at the end of the day, brush your teeth, it's hard for adults too. I hear it a lot, not just about kids, but from adults too, and that's, the transition, and that can even be task paralysis, but point being, it's nothing that you struggle with is, like, unique to you, and that's not to say, like, it's no big deal, but to say, like, "Dude, you're not alone," and once you're
Mhm.
brave enough to kind of go there and, like, dip your toe in sharing it, you'll be amazed at how much the community pops up and is like, "Same, here's what I learned how to do," and that leap of courage and, like, authenticity pays off so much.
Mhm. And we also wanna acknowledge that even acknowledging that to yourself or bringing it up to someone else can be really hard because
Oh, yeah.
sometimes you're not sure what the response is going to be, right? Is it, like you first said, "Oh, this happens to a lot of people. It's not that big of a deal," because 'cause I'm sure people have had that experience before versus, "Oh, this happens to a lot of people. You're not alone. There are so many different ways that we can help you overcome this, and you don't have to feel like this is a personality flaw or a moral
Mhm.
failing because look at all of the people that this also happens to." Which that dichotomy on its own can make you internally feel so different because on the one hand, you're feeling seen. On the other hand, you're feeling dismissed, which then leads you to hiding this behavior even more and feeling even worse about this behavior, which is obviously not helpful. So,
Yeah. I just thought about there's an app called Mighty, and they have, like, little communities inside of it where you can talk about different struggles that you have, and that's been huge to kind of relate to people, and it's certainly a space that I don't know all the communities, obviously, but just that kind of forum where you can connect with other humans or going through the same thing can really make a difference. Oh, I love that you pointed out that executive function and like any disordered eating, any patterns that you have, it's not a moral failing, it's not a character flaw. I think that's super important to help ask your brain with some curiosity pretty regularly. Does this actually mean I'm a bad person? Does this equate with poor morality? Or am I late because I'm still figuring out some time management strategies? Or did I forget a birthday because I'm not yet using a calendar system that works for my brain? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, oftentimes we think, well, good and moral people are always perfect with their executive function. And sometimes that is how the world's presenting. And it's certainly the feedback that we get when we have, like, well, you're late because you don't care. Or if you wanted to, you could do XYZ. And so it's not that you're like inventing this, but at the same time, it's a freeing exercise in your brain to say, does that make me a bad person? And the answer is usually no. Or you could even say, like, okay, what else could be behind this if your brain's not ready for the like full blown yes or no answer? What else could be behind this? Like, what else could be leading me to have this particular struggle?
Yes. So, on that note, I would love if you could talk a little bit more about some strategies to give your brain some love, like we were talking about before.
Oh, yes. Some good love for your brain. Actually, you know what? I learned this from you, Dana, and I've used it so much like when I'm training like companies and teacher groups of teachers and stuff. And that's like, think of yourself as a mammal very first. Like, oftentimes we're like, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me?" And I did this when you and I were working together and I first moved. I was like, "I don't feel good. I feel off. Something's wrong." And you're like, "Sister, you just moved. You own a business." You're like listing all these things. I'm like, "Oh yeah." You're like, "Maybe you need some rest and to make friends in your new town and to settle your house." And I'm like, "Dana, it's not that simple." And it definitely was. So there's that. Thank
Yes.
you. That's my long way of saying thank you. But,
Oh, thanks.
you know, but it really does make sense. If you're feeling a little bit off, think of yourself as a mammal very first. Dehydration has a huge impact on executive function. And we're not even talking a like I didn't drink all day kind of thing. We're thinking I went for maybe a 2-mile walk and didn't have any water. That small amount of dehydration is shown to impact like cognitive function. So that if you're super tired, you haven't had your glymphatic system clean up your brain, so to speak, at night. So you through a dirty brain, that's not obviously not dirty, but you know what I mean. Um,
Sluggish, yeah.
yeah, that's gonna impact you. If you haven't had a lot of fun and you're kind of moving through life based on sheer force of will rather than that connection and like the opportunities to grow all the chemicals in your brain. If you haven't had a lot of opportunity to develop the balance of neurotransmitters that you need, that's another way to kind of stop and say, okay, not me, the human failing. I think my brain needs some stuff. And that can be a game changer in terms of just a reset and a new perspective to think about yourself rather than beating on yourself for not like having an off day.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I love this. I feel
Wow,
like
me
we could
too.
talk about this stuff all day, but I do wanna be respectful of your time. So, 1, I would love if you could talk a little bit about Brain Tool School, because that would be really cool. And then, of course, thank you so much for coming on and talking to the people about dysregulation and ADHD and executive function and everything. And so after you talk about Brain Tool School, I would love if you could tell people where they can find you,
Heck yeah.
potentially in a dual course later with us.
I know. There you go. Watch for me and Dana. And you can probably email us and say you would like it, and then we'll have a visual prompt to actually do it, right?
Very true. Yep.
No, just kidding. That's not on you all. It does sound amazing though. Okay. Brain Tool School is a lovely place that we are developing, and we're actually shifting it a little bit because right now we have a 6-month kind of rolling enrollment. Students come in and they're learning skills for life after high school. So it's usually like high school sophomores all the way into like college students. But we're recognizing like there's a shift in kind of financial feels and commitments and insecurity and uncertainty right now. So we're shifting to make it smaller bits of information and different ways to engage so that it's family friendly, because that's always what we're aiming for. And then within Brain Tool School, we're also developing a coach training program so people can do what I do, which is amazing. I love my job. I love my people. I say that probably 6 times a day at least. Like, I love my people. So, if executive function coaching sounds amazing to you, it is. And we'll have a coach development program soon. So, oh, and Dana, my book for teachers is coming out in August. So, that's a super exciting part. I'll give you the info about like pre-orders and stuff like that. So, people can find me on the Executive Function podcast and at Sarah Kesty, KESTY.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Oh, I'm so excited about your book.
Oh my gosh, me too. Talk about executive function. That was
Right?
a lot.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So if people have comments or questions, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave them below. You can also email us at millennialbodyimageproject@gmail.com. Find us on all of the socials. Those will all be linked in the show notes below. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.